Welcome to another Mod Spotlight. This is Samurai Warlords for Medieval Total War 1. So, you might ask, why is there a Sengoku mod given that, Medieval 1 came out after Shogun Total War 1? Well, a few reasons. For one thing, the campaign has a number of new factions, whereas the Shogun 1 campaign had, I believe, 8. Next, this mod was initially made, I think, primarily as a multiplayer mod. So, you could play without owning Shogun 1 for one thing. Medieval 1, I think, was in some ways more moddable than Shogun 1. Another big thing would be Medieval 1 had replays. Now, you could get replays to work in Shogun 1, but it was pretty janky. You had to, do some text file editing and some lines in your shortcut. Yeah, so having the official replay feature was always really nice in the multiplayer community, which makes sense. That's why I started recording VOD, Hacking Shot, and the like, was they lacked that feature. So, otherwise it's more or less like Shogun 1, a little bit different graphics, some added units. There's, for some reason, the early period, this is a campaign battle replay. In the early period, there's crossbowmen, which crossbow wasn't unknown in Japan, but I think it hadn't really been used in a military sense for a good 700 years, 800 years by this point. In earlier Japanese history, the imperial court was more explicitly modeling not just itself, but also its military on Chinese models. China used large armies of conscript infantry, including crossbowmen. But that kind of fell out of style in Japan because this army just wasn't that great at the kind of war they were fighting, which was versus the Emishi, the people of the north of Japan who fought a largely guerrilla war as mounted archers. So the samurai were basically, local nobility who fought as mounted archers to deal with the problem. So I don't know what's up with this shit. But to be fair, I also don't really know what's up with the, big blocks of two-handed swordsmen. I've said before that the games in this engine are, in a lot of ways, more realistic than modern Total War. I've never really meant that in terms of unit rosters, that was never the case, but more in the mechanics of morale, movement, gunfire. The AI, I think, is in a lot of ways better. So, yeah, and speaking of multiplayer, I may have mentioned this in the Musket and Pike mod spotlight, but multiplayer still works. So you can't just load the game up and do it. You do need to install a third-party program of one sort or another that you can use to trick your computers into thinking that they're on a LAN. But once you've done that, you can play multiplayer no problem for Medieval 1 or any of its mods. It's still pretty fun. The UI does take getting used to. If you haven't played these games from back in the day, it's a little bit difficult in that it's left click to move somewhere, but also left click to select a unit, so you'll spend a fair amount of time until you get used to things, accidentally left clicking a unit to move somewhere instead of selecting the next unit, so then you have to unfuck everything. Which in multiplayer and the inability to pause and issue orders, of course, can get interesting. But again, once you get used to things, it's not a huge deal. So, crossbowmen need to fire on a flat trajectory and have line of sight. Archers fire in an arc. I haven't really played the recent games, but it's my understanding that they're much more generous about line of sight, things like that. Also, archers aren't as efficient shooting targets if they have to overshoot friendlies in between. They also are less efficient, for anything more than 2 or 3 ranks. So we counter the charge of the swordsmen with our own, and get the Yashigaru crossbowmen the hell out of there. Note the longer spears with the Yari Yashigaru. This is actually pretty accurate. The samurai fought in even looser formations and somewhat more individualistically in general, and the Yashigaru eventually were trained to fight in these more disciplined formations of still spears. You could say pikemen and the yari could get very long, but they didn't fight like dense European style pike blocks. The formations were always shallower, looser, and more flexible. So yeah, the Ashigaru, they saw their friendly samurai fleeing, which gave them a heavy morale shock. So that would be something interesting if it were in fog. If like seeing, I don't know, the silver shields break freaked out everyone else. The classic example, I guess, would be the breaking of the middle guard at Waterloo. You have a bit of that Jedi general phenomenon too. If you're familiar with the old games, you remember them being quite difficult to kill. The crown that's normally on the leader flag for nobles has been replaced by a fan of authority. Very appropriate. And at this point, we've repulsed the attackers, and it's just a matter of mop up. So this is still fun. I mean, it's basically Shogun Total War 1 plus. So if you like games set in the period and you're familiar with or interested in the old games, uh, it wouldn't be a bad move to just immediately play this mod instead of playing the original Shogun 1, honestly. They're fairly similar, and I think this is basically a slightly improved version of it. And it is fun in multiplayer. I haven't recorded any of my multiplayer matches of these games, but maybe I'll do that eventually.